Afternoon, we'll go ahead and start the February 8th Local Government Small Business Advisory Group meeting. Well, unfortunately, let me open it up by saying that both Mayor Benoit is sick today, so he wasn't able to make it in, and Supervisor Rutherford is not available today. She has a speaking engagement, so I know in the past when they haven't been, we're still able to move forward with the meeting. So we'll open it up for item number 1, update and discussion, or actually, let me say this before we do that. You want to do introductions and then maybe some updates or notifications by the members? Why don't we start at the end there, Eddie?
Hi, Eddie Marquez, Altair Paramount.
Happy New Year, Paul Avila Associates.
Rita Loof, Radtech International.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Jeff Blake, Metal Finishers Association and Small Business Alliance.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Derek Alatorre, South Coast AQMD.
Fabian Wesson, South Coast AQMD.
Cynthia Moran, City of Chino Hills.
Jessica Chavez, AQMD staff. Elaine Hills, AQMD staff. Orlando Grove, AQMD staff.
So I just want to say, want to make an announcement before. This is actually Lori's last meeting. She's transferring. She got a promotion, so she's going to our legal department. She'll be joining Nancy. So I just want to thank Lori for all her years of support on this committee. Yeah. Yeah, that's okay, because it's, what goes around comes around, right? So I'll snag one of theirs. I do firmly believe in that. Elaine's going to be taking over. Elaine's already been here and working on committee. So Elaine, and then once we get Lori's replacement, we'll bring that person on board too. Okay, so I just want to say that thank you, Lori, for all your years of help on this.
Thank you, Lori. Thanks, you guys. You guys are awesome.
So why don't we go to also remarks? Are there any other remarks or any other remarks? Go ahead, Paul.
Before we officially get started, I have 2 questions. One of them, perhaps you can answer this for me, Junior, but maybe you can't. I had breakfast with the city manager, Wes Covina, yesterday, and the developer was in regarding the project up on the old BKK landfill, and AQMD was mentioned. And my comment to you is, or question is there any activity from AQMD monitoring that old landfill currently? Do you know?
So my understanding, that's a Superfund site. The original owners, I think it was I forget the name of the family that owned it. They went
the old BKK.
Yeah, it was, I forget the name, but they went belly up. So actually, DTSC and federal EPA took over the site, and they're doing the monitoring. It's not so much the air they're concerned about; it's what's buried underneath and getting into soil and the groundwater. I'm not sure if we have any involvement in that right now. I can ask and find out and get back to you on that. But I believe ours, if there's anything, is very minimal. It's mainly a DTSC EPA Superfund site.
And the second one, is there a separate committee for the refineries?
So yes, there is. There is a refinery committee made up of governing board members.
I see. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we start with the agenda items? Seeing none, why don't we go to item number 2, that is the approval of the December 8th, 2017 meeting minutes. Do I hear any questions or comments or edits to it? Hearing none, do I get a motion and a second for that? Okay, Jeffrey puts forth the motion, Paul seconds it. So any objections? Hearing none or seeing none, the item is approved. The next item is number 3. It's review and follow-up action items from our last meeting. This is probably the easiest one. There are none. So being that there is none, we'll go to the next item. item number 4, which is the adoption of local government small business assistance advisory group 2017 accomplishments and 2018 goals and objectives. I know, Rita, you wanted to add something to that?
Yes, thank you. And I apologize for not thinking about this sooner to include in the previous draft proposal, but actually just came to my mind a couple of weeks ago. LA County Sanitation had a symposium for industry and members of the public who wanted to attend, specifically about the availability of chrome-free materials or hexavalent chrome-free, because there's a trivalent chrome process. We have, some of our members have alternatives. They have chrome-free materials. So in light of 1469, what came to my mind was this was being done for more of a water quality perspective and waste reduction perspective. But I think it would be good for the district to put on some sort of informational event, especially for the small businesses that can't get on a plane and go to Chicago to our conference in May, to have some information about the availability of options and to have some information about what funding is available from the district to help them comply, rather than just to, have a rule that just puts these mandates on industry that are being perceived as very onerous. And some of these businesses are concerned that they won't be able to afford the controls that are being mandated. So this would just be an opportunity for people to find out more information about chrome-free or, hex chrome-free options.
So since that's going to be outside the purview of Small Business Assistance Advisory Group or local gov small business assistance, I can recommend that to Phil, Planning Rules, because it's an event and really not tied to this advisory group. But I can mention to him that this is a suggestion by the advisory group and see if he's amenable. I'm sure he would be, because I think it was already brought up once
So maybe
before.
our group can help in, in partnering with another district division, because I wasn't aware that there's prohibition against our committee. And I wouldn't say have it as part of this committee, but just as a partnership with
Sure.
other divisions. in
Only
the
because you said it's an event, and this advisory group doesn't hold events. So it's something that maybe Phil shop, and I'm sure Phil will be amenable to it after some pressure on him, maybe a little bit. But I think he'll go along with that. I think it's a good idea. I heard something about that before. Was that your event, David?
It's not necessarily from my group at the sanitation districts, but actually my former boss runs that division. And I called him before this meeting because Rita was talking to me about it, and he said he would be amenable to, working something out.
Okay.
And by the way, that particular group meets this upcoming Tuesday, and Phil is providing a presentation on 6/17.
Okay.
So there's already a little bit of coordination. It'd be very easy to hold a special event.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So we'll work on that with the, if you give me just a name.
Dave Snyder.
Yeah, so Laurie, did you get that?
David Snyder.
And if you can give me a phone number for him, that'd be great, so we can contact him and see if we can organize something.
On a separate item regarding the proposed 2018 goals and objectives, and maybe this is something for Mayor Benoit, but sort of the concept I'd like to discuss is, rather than having staff do presentations to the group here, if there's anything that we could provide as a sounding board for upcoming issues or being more involved in the process, I'm sure a number of us would be happy to do that. But sitting and listening to presentations, I don't know if that's as productive a use of everyone's time as it could be.
Okay.
I think people could actually provide a resource to staff if that's something we want to do here.
Okay, we'll put that down. Any other items? Seeing none, can I get a motion to accept as amended the 2017 accomplishments and 2018 goals and objectives?
Move it.
Okay,
Second?
thank you, Bill. Dave seconds it. Any objections? Seeing none, the motion is approved. Item is approved. We're going to take this a little bit out of order because Phil's in a meeting right now, and I just left that meeting. He'll be here shortly. I'm going to move it down to have Dave DeBoer go ahead and give the item number 6. Presentation, proposed Rule 1420 emissions standard for lead. Thanks, Dave.
Hi, this is Mike Morris. I'm not Dave, but I'll be doing the presentation for 1420. Our Rule 1420 was recently amended, and just wanted to provide the committee a brief update on what exactly we did with that particular regulation. So as background for this, in 2008, the EPA was looking at numerous health studies about the impacts of lead, especially lead on the health of children with respect to the IQ and memory loss and other things like that. And they revised their standard for emissions of lead from 1.5 micrograms per cubic meter down to 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter. At around the same time, we were having issues with a couple of our lead facilities, specifically our lead acid battery recycling facilities. And as part of our 2012 lead state implementation plan, we committed to the EPA to update our Rule 1420 series. So basically our Rule 1420 was originally adopted in 1992 as a one-size-fits-all rule for lead sources. And as part of that 2012 state implementation plan, we looked at splitting up the rule, bifurcating the rule into different parts depending on the size of the facility. So we adopted back in November 2010 Rule 1420.1, which specifically addresses the lead acid recycling battery recyclers, where they're processing over 50,000 tons of lead per year. We then, in 2015, adopted Rule 1420.2, which addresses our larger metal melting facilities, those that process more than 100 tons per year. And finally, just recently, we amended Rule 1420, which is all the remaining lead processing facilities. So who's using lead and who's impacted by these rules? Well, I already mentioned the lead acid battery recycling facilities. Most of the lead use in the Southern California area is based on battery, either manufacturing or recycling. There are some other operations that do utilize lead. They are facilities that either melt metals and the alloy contains lead on purpose, or they're melting metals and the lead is a trace contaminant in the metals. Other operations include tin lead plating and also soldering operations. We found that most of the lead usage of the impacted facilities, which we estimated to be just over 100, are these small tin lead plating operations and soldering operations. Those operations have very low lead emission rates. They're not high temperature, and they're usually very well controlled. There are approximately 15 facilities, though, that are using lead either as a contaminant or as an alloy at a metal melting facilities in high enough quantities that they're actually processing more than 2 tons per year of lead. And so we wanted the rule to recognize both the smaller users and adjust the rule accordingly for them, as well as having stricter requirements for these larger metal melting facilities. Finally, what we also wanted to do as part of the rule development process was to recognize that a lot of these facilities are trying to move away from lead processing. And so we did incorporate into the rule an exemption for facilities that are using very low contents of lead. Basically, it's a trace contaminant. And a lot of the facilities are actively moving away from products that have lead in them greater than 0.05%, so that they can be excluded from the rule provisions. The key requirements for the rule, for those that are going to be subject to all parts of the rule, include an ambient lead limit, as well as point source controls, building enclosures, housekeeping, record keeping requirements, and conditional ambient lead monitoring. And as I mentioned, there's only about 15 facilities that are subject to that portion of Rule 1420. For the smaller facilities, it's basically just the points, the ambient lead limit, the housekeeping, record keeping, and conditional ambient lead monitoring. We don't require those smaller facilities to do point source pollution controls or building enclosures. I'll be going over in the next few slides some of the key requirements in the rule that we adopted. Basically, as I mentioned, the ambient lead concentration limit, the point source controls, building enclosures, and enhanced housekeeping. So for the ambient lead monitoring requirements, as I mentioned earlier, the EPA lowered their limit down to 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter. We're adopting the same limit initially for 1420, but we are lowering that limit down to 0.100 in 2 years. One of the things that we noticed that we wanted to incorporate into the rule was that if we did see issues arising around these facilities, that they would be required to do their own monitorings around the facility. Otherwise, we'll be doing the monitoring if need be, as necessary. And it may be as part of our proposed 1480 regulation that there may be some monitoring that goes on around these facilities that might indicate that there's an issue for some of these smaller metal melting operations.
I've got a question. I think you've probably got a few thousand of us who are still concerned about this air monitoring. And I know I'm aware of AB 617, but who decides that monitoring is required on this? You said that monitoring might be done by the facility, or maybe the staff might decide that monitoring is necessary. If I'm a business owner in a particular location, can I expect to get an invoice someday for thousands of dollars, saying because you decided that monitoring was necessary and I didn't know anything about it?
No, that's not how this particular rule works. So basically, if we happen to have evidence through monitoring or something else that there may be an issue at the facility, then the rule process is that we would notify the facility and let them know that we found an issue. We'd give them a time to respond back to us with any type of evidence that they'd like to provide that perhaps it wasn't them as the source. And then we would make that determination, go back to the facility and say, okay, based on the information that we have at the time, we feel that you have to monitor, or that you don't have to monitor. And at that point, they would be aware that the monitoring was required.
Now, depending on the quantity that your monitoring might detect, maybe it's a cumulative impacts situation where you may have my facility here, a metal grinding shop on the opposite corner, and somebody else on a third corner down the street. Would the cost of that monitoring be distributed evenly according to what your findings are, or how does that work? How do you apportion that out?
Well, cumulative impacts are something that have been an issue for not just these smaller lead facilities, but also the larger ones. When they're doing the monitor, they do upwind, downwind to try and triangulate what the source is. And so in that case, we feel like if we do make that determination that that facility is the source of the lead emissions, that we'd be confident to say that they should start doing the monitoring. Otherwise, I think it would be incumbent upon us to do further monitoring until we can triangulate that source. So for these larger facilities that need to control their point sources, we're asking that they control them to a level of 99% or to 0.0003 pounds per hour. That's consistent with our Rule 1420.2. We put in the 0.0003 pound per hour limit to allow facilities that believe that they don't need control to be able to demonstrate that their source is so minimal that, in fact, it doesn't need to have a control device associated with it. In addition, it provides facilities a way to demonstrate that they don't need to do as much source testing. So if they can show that they're half of that limit or 0.00015, then they'll go from doing biannual source testing to quadrennial source testing. So generally the cost of the test for a single metal, we're estimating it to be between $6,000 and $10,000. Yes.
On the record keeping variable, is that primarily for the little lead producers?
Yes. So
And let me understand if I get this right. Let's say I'm a small lead refinery or a lead producer, a little guy, maybe 12 or 13 employees, and I do dollar-wise, let's say ton-wise, I only do 50 tons a year. I sell 50 tons or 100 tons of lead, but it's small numbers. So the record keeping, basically, I'd come here once a year to AQMD and say, I only do 100 tons or 75 tons of lead. Here's my record keeping. The analysis is done, and then I get a clean bill of health, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting that you picked that number, 50, 75. So our threshold for what we consider a small lead facility is 2 tons.
Okay.
So it's much lower than that. And what we found, again, is that the vast majority of our facilities are below 2 tons. Those facilities, all they need to do is demonstrate that they're below the 2 tons. That's what the record keeping is for. And then they do the housekeeping, which is basically sweep around their operations, make sure that they're not creating lead dust piles and so forth, that their debris is contained in closed containers. And I'll talk a little bit more exactly about what the in-house housekeeping is. For those larger facilities that are doing more, then these are where these types of requirements kick in. So one of the things that we found that contributes to some of the issues that arise around some of these lead producing facilities, fugitive emissions. And so we did include 2 particular provisions to address fugitive emissions. One is a total enclosure requirement, the other is the housekeeping. So for the total enclosure requirement, basically wherever they're doing lead processing, we're asking that they have basically 4 walls and a roof. And that will contain a lot of the lead dust. Ideally, you'll see some buildings that do have openings and things like that. And we're just trying to minimize the cross draft so that we're not getting the lead leaving the facility and becoming a legacy problem outside of their normal operations. For the housekeeping provisions, a lot of what we're doing is based on what was adopted through the larger facilities, our rules 1420.1 and .2. They're very consistent with that. Basically, again, designed to minimize the fugitive dust around the facilities. And what we're seeing, or what we've seen in the past with these types of sources, is that they may not have a lot of emissions that are coming out of their stacks, but they're having a lot of lead dust settling around their facility. And without control of the dust, that dust will eventually leave their facility and go into the surrounding communities and create trouble that way. So that basically concludes my presentation for 1420. Yes.
A question. Not being a trained scientist like some people are here, enlighten me. Can you give me a very brief explanation on lead dust? And not to sound like, I just fell off the turnip truck, but is it heavier than normal dust? And let's say this whole room was filled with lead dust. Can you see it?
Yes and yes. So lead is naturally heavy. A lot of people use it for weights. It's a very common material for
Fishing
scuba
weights.
diving belts, fishing weights, tire weights. It's very small, compact material, very dense. So yes, and it is a visible material. It's a silvery gray type of powder. It might be difficult to be able to distinguish lead dust from other types of dust, other than its kind of shiny color. But when we generally see it, it's part of a greater metal alloy, and so it might more look like metal than just plain lead.
Once it sits out, exposed to the elements, it really breaks down into lead oxide.
Right.
That's a whole different.
Yes, and with the lighter material, then we see greater dust emissions because the wind and accumulation or movement, whether it be vehicles or people walking around, tends to exacerbate the problem.
Any other questions? So we just got some new members arrive. Why don't you introduce yourselves? Rochelle, you want to start with Rochelle?
Sure. Hi, Rochelle Rismendi with Pacific Asian Consortium and Employment.
Lavon Daniel with Danco.
Thank you, Todd. Okay, next item that we took out of, we're returning to Phil Fine. He's going to be discussing AB 617, community identification process. Phil?
Thanks, Derek, and I apologize for being a little bit behind schedule. Good afternoon, everyone, by 4 minutes. I'm very happy to talk today about AB 617. For those of you who have followed the state legislature, what this bill that was signed by the governor last fall was a companion piece to the reauthorization of the cap and trade program. So the background is, the cap and trade GHG program was going to expire in 2020. The legislature, there was a lot of interest in the legislature to extend that program, but a lot of the environmental justice groups and environmental advocates were concerned that the benefits of that program were not necessarily being felt in local communities that had local air quality impacts and local air quality concerns. So as part of the deal, the cap and trade was extended, and then a companion bill, AB 617, was passed that really is a significant change in the way that the state, California Air Resources Board, and the local air districts go about doing air quality regulation. We still have all our old responsibilities for meeting regional air quality goals and federal and state standards, but now we have an additional responsibility to really focus in on communities and try to reduce risk there. It's not that we have not been doing these types of programs for many, many years at the local levels here and throughout the state. It's that this really puts a structure around it and lights a fire with CARB and the local districts to give it renewed focus. And fortunately, what's also come with that is resources to do that, which was the main thing that had always been lacking. So just to get into it a little bit, what are the key components of this legislation? These are the four main components. There's a few more that I won't get into today, but the main components are a monitoring component in these communities, community emission reduction plans in those communities, requirements for best available retrofit control technology, and then a statewide emissions reporting system. So I'll go into each of these a little more detail. So the first task, and this goes for both the monitoring and the community emission reduction plans, is to identify and prioritize communities. I'll go into more details on this in a moment. The state is supposed to have a statewide monitoring plan that the districts need to implement, and that there will be a statewide data display of all the data collected by monitoring. The state will also have a statewide strategy structure for these community emission reduction plans, and there will be a state role in that, state oversight role. But again, the district will be the primary responsibility for carrying that out. To the right, best available retrofit control technology. So this came about largely in reaction to our reclaim program. There was concern at the legislative level that our local cap and trade program for NOx emissions was not achieving its goals, that it was not requiring controls on facilities in the way that it was anticipated. So therefore, the state legislation has a specific requirement for best available retrofit control technology to go on the larger sources and a timeline to do so. For us, we had our board had already adopted the position that we were going to sunset the reclaim program anyway. The timelines that our board adopted were a little bit longer than the timelines that this legislation adopted, but essentially it's moving us in the same direction. Finally, on the emissions reporting side, a uniform statewide system of emissions reporting such that they can put it on their statewide pollution mapping tool, which is kind of already live because of some previous legislation, AB 197 from a couple years ago. However, we already have our local emissions reporting, so we're working closely with CARB to make sure there's not a lot of duplication or conflicts there.
Phil,
Yes.
I'm not too familiar with this program because it's relatively new. But my understanding is that it has more of a focus on toxic air emissions. Some criteria, but I thought the focus was toxic air emissions.
If you read the legislation, it's both.
Okay.
Probably given equal weight. Our view as a local district is it's going to involve more toxics.
Okay, and then, so how is that going to, is there going to be a T-backed component on this clearinghouse?
Yes. So that is one of the things that CARB is working on. Is it's a backed bark, not just for criteria pollutants, but also for toxics. So something called T-barked, which is not something that we talk about that much. But that statewide clearinghouse is just informational. It's not going to require necessarily at this point districts to adopt all that. It's just a clearinghouse to go to see what different districts have done. Okay. Yes.
And you did a really good job. You compared the different, Al Moritsuchi's, what was his legislation, fence line community monitoring?
1647.
1647. You guys gave us a sheet where you cross-referenced all the different laws,
Yeah.
and that was very helpful. Are you going to talk about that later today, or?
This isn't specifically on that, but there is overlap between the monitoring that will be done because of AB 1647, which is a refinery fence line and community monitoring statute signed into law, and our Rule 1180, which followed that to have our local requirements. So there is overlap in this community monitoring. How that all comes together is still part of the process. This is still very early in the implementation
Okay,
phase.
good. See, that's where I was confused. I was thinking, am I missing that connection? There's a nexus somewhere because there is a lot of overlap, and I was missing it. So if we haven't identified that yet, then I feel a little better.
Yeah, we anticipate a lot of overlap. If you go to the agenda, that was what was presented at our last governing board meeting in the first week of February. There was a presentation that tried to tie some of that together a little bit. So there's 20 to 30 slides there that people can take a look at. But I'm not going over that for this presentation.
Felipe, you have a question?
You know, when I was at the couple of conferences when the AQMD put out some monitors that you were parading around showing people, how these monitors, low-cost monitors, could basically be utilized. And are these going to be part of this process where you're going to be, maybe teaching the community how to operate these monitors?
Absolutely, that's part of it. But as the previous question, does this program focus on toxics versus criteria pollutants or PM? Those monitors have proven out to be pretty good at PM and pretty okay at ozone, but to date we haven't found anything that's really great for toxics yet. So we're stuck with either traditional methods or maybe very expensive methods at this point. Hopefully there's some developments that make them lower cost.
Now, just go back on this thing of the monitors, Are these monitors certified? Are you guys certifying that these monitors are accurate? Or is there some process that these monitors can be utilized in a legal manner? In other words, going after those people that are creating that pollution?
So currently, we have the SCAQMD program. I'm sure you've heard of that. It's a whole center that its sole goal is to test out all the commercially available low-cost sensors on the market and present the results. It is not yet a certification program. Personally, I have some concerns about certification because usually when you certify a traditional monitor, it's not just saying, hey, this works and any number that comes out of that for the rest of time is accurate. It's only certified if you operate it a certain way, calibrate it a certain way, maintain it a certain way, which is much harder to do with these low-cost sensors.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a concern that if SCAQMD stamp of approval certified that everyone's going to trust every number is accurate, but 5 years, 2 years, 6 months after deploying it, it is not operating correctly, and our name's on it, that's the concern. But there is room to start doing things like that and to bring those lower cost sensors into the more regulatory framework with the proper controls.
So you're saying that right now those monitors that you have put out are not certified. You don't certify them, the validity of the
No, but they provide
results.
great information.
No, but I'm saying, but you don't certify them. I know they provide great information.
Our program does not do the certification yet.
Okay, so there is no certification for those things.
Not at the current time.
Thank you.
So before we get to Todd, I leaned over to Nancy because obviously I don't want to do anything I'm not supposed to do, but an item or an idea I had when we were talking about this about SCAQMD is I know staff has come in and given a presentation on SCAQMD, but what about a tour of the lab? Is this something that the group would like in the future? The SCAQMD is actually part of the lab tour. So if that's an idea, if that's what you want to do, we can, we'll have to agendize it for one of the meetings, but that's more than, we're more than happy to give that, if that's what you guys would like.
Great.
Okay. So Todd, you had a question?
So I had a follow-up question, Philip. Does that mean that you're going to rely more heavily upon MATES 2 or your MATES studies to determine where the toxic concentrations are throughout the district, or?
I'll get into community identification in a subsequent slide, but that's one of the factors we'll be looking at.
Okay, because you do certify those tests.
Most of the equipment, not all, a lot of the equipment used in the MATES studies are established EPA methods or CARB methods or SCAQMD methods.
Right. Okay.
All right, so this is the same 4 components, but this is the timing. And it is, I'll just say overall, without going into details, it's very, very tight. Communities identified and statewide monitoring plans and statewide strategies all by October of this year. So this is an incredibly tight schedule for all the work that needs to be done. And then some implementation coming in terms of monitoring by July of next year, community reduction plans by October of next year, and then BARC implementation by 2023. Excuse me. Incredibly tight for the amount of work that needs to be done. CARB created a whole new division to do this. We've hired 47 new staff the board approved with some funding that came along with this. So it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's all going to be a incredible challenge. Our goal is just to do it show as much progress as possible. So just to get a question.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No.
It's a discussion.
Yeah, the I guess it was Wednesday, CARB came out with their concept paper for their AB 617.
The community
Air
identification.
Protection Program framework, yeah. And early in it, it's about 80-some pages long, early in it, their timeline, and I've read through that briefly, it looks like, at least to the lay reader, that according to their timeline, air districts are encouraged to do much of the work or all the work that you've got up here, but they refer to it as recommendations. You're talking about actual implementation versus recommendations. At least that's what I get. Aren't you getting ahead of the Air Resources Board because they're looking at September of this year to accumulate input from air districts, the community, other stakeholders, and so on. And for the next element of their plan, how do you know, or how do we know that there isn't going to be some redundancy, some duplication, and steps in here that?
So I haven't mentioned any implementation on our part previous to October of 2018, which is their deadline to set up those statewide structures and those statewide documents. All we're doing before then, and that was in the concept paper and some related documents, is identifying communities and what they're proposing to do, and the districts fully support. In fact, the idea came from the districts, was that rather than them identify communities up in Sacramento, that the districts be allowed to do the outreach and put together the district level priorities for the communities that should be focused on. And so that is our immediate task. That is what we're working. I'm going to get into this later, but that is our immediate task right now. And that will take the form of eventually some kind of report that will be adopted by our governing board and then sent on to CARB for their consideration in their statewide monitoring plan and their statewide strategy by October of 2018.
Okay, well, I'll hold any other questions I have till later in your presentation, but right now, I guess what I'm hearing you say is that your timeline is compatible with what's in the
I'm saying they're very tight, but compatible, but challenging. How about that? Okay. To one other point you have, and I don't think I have this in the other slides, if you wait till October of 2018 before we know where we need to monitor, and then we have a deadline of July 2019 to actually do the monitoring, that is 9 months to set up monitoring networks. That is typically not enough time.
Oh, I know, but maybe as a spin-off of the earlier question over here about MATES, you're starting MATES 5, last month, I guess, or whenever it was. So you're going to have a full year of toxic monitoring, at least under your, or almost a year, 10 months, I guess, under your belt by October, which should be far more reliable than any handheld monitoring or anything like that.
Yeah, and we have the previous MATES 4 study.
And MATES 4.
So that's going into the equation for sure. We're definitely looking at all that. But that type of monitoring, at least the core MATES monitoring, which is focused on regional air toxics, is a little bit different than focusing on a community and having a monitoring network within the community. But it's very useful for us to help through this process and have that data. So if I may, I'm going to get into these in a little more detail as we go. Button. So the key implementation issues for us, and some of this is being worked out as we speak, and every week there's new developments. But the funding was a key issue for us. To implement this without additional funding was not going to be possible. So we were successful, along with the other air districts, in getting $27 million statewide for implementation at a one-time first-year down payment. And of that $27 million, $10.7 million came to the district here. And then in addition to that, as part of the greenhouse gas cap and trade revenue, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, out of that, $250 million was allocated statewide for Carl Moyer Prop 1B type mobile source emission reduction projects as kind of a early action start on helping out getting emission reductions in these communities. So the district got $107 million of that statewide pot. And there's more. That was kind of pre-programmed, but there's another 200 to 300 million of GGRF funding for similar emission reduction type projects that is typically competitively bid at the state level, and typically we've been very successful in those competitive bids. So there's probably another 100 to 200 million that either us or other entities in the district who apply for that funding are going to be able to access to get the same type of emission reductions. It's not quite the $1 billion a year in the AQMP, but it's not bad. It's still less than a year later. So our issues, staffing obviously is an issue for all these different things, for the monitoring, the equipment for the monitoring, the community ID process and outreach that we're just getting started with now. These emission reduction plans could be little mini AQMPs in every community. The BARC rules and reclaim and that implementation is an all-encompassing task for our planning division right now. And then these other issues are a little bit less time-consuming, the emission inventory, the BARCed and backed clearinghouse. It's a lot of that's on CARB's side, but we really need to interact with them to make sure that they take into account some of the knowledge that we've developed locally. And as I mentioned, the deadlines are challenging. So I'm going to go through each one. It's a little more detail. So this process and criteria for identifying communities is actively being developed. This week, along with that concept paper that CARB released, a couple ideas for how to do the community nominations. There's one set for districts to do the nomination to CARB. There's a separate pathway for individual communities to nominate themselves directly to CARB. And what CARB is doing in the concept paper outlines is kind of the general criteria and process for doing the community identification. I talked about the air districts and others submitting nominations. Most of the outreach and public process will probably be done by the districts. And then how do we do this community identification? Obviously, we're looking for input from the communities, from the public, from groups like this. But just, first blush, we have CalEnviroScreen, which kind of ranks by census tract and kind of environmental justice impacts. We have our MATE studies, as we've previously mentioned. We have our emissions reporting programs. We know exactly where those facilities are. We also have health risk assessments over the years, and for stationary sources and some for mobile sources like rail yards. And the approach we want to take is, rather than just pick our top 2 communities and give that to CARB in year 1 and then 2 or 3 more communities in year 2, we wanted to have a comprehensive list with our priorities and make sure everyone we're very inclusive. But when it comes to prioritizing and ranking, that's where we need some input on how we weight the different factors and what's more important.
Philip, before we move on, real quick question. On the process for ranking, I saw something from CARB that included a criteria for NOVs. I don't know if that's set in stone or it's going that direction.
It's something we're not thrilled with.
And the only reason I don't think that's a bad thing to consider, but my concern is, at least what I'm seeing at the moment, there's a little bit more emphasis on enforcement. And if you have a minor issue that's not emission related, it's like you don't jump through the right hoop that it's not a big infraction. Should it be put in the same boat of something that is a concern to the community?
So we have concerns with that as a metric as well. It's being looked at 2 ways: as a criteria for community selection, but also as a criteria for measuring progress. In both, we have some concerns because you go into a community and you do 100, 200 inspections and you don't find an NOV. That's a good thing, right? Not a bad thing. Your metric of enforcement shouldn't be how many NOVs you issue. If people are complying, that's good. And then in terms of identifying, it's really hard to compare cross communities and cross sources. Like we don't issue NOVs for mobile sources or things like that. It's very, so you could have a very impacted community that you just don't have NOVs for, and you can have another community where it's one facility that has a lot of NOVs, but they're all administrative or not really emissions related. So we are not, we're working very closely with CARB. We're working well together. I can't say we have 100% agreement on every single line item and every single.
I know this is not in your control, but you're lobbying on behalf of South Coast. Do you have a sense for, is this kind of going towards a popularity contest, which would disturb me, versus you have actual factual data saying, someone the other day actually made it turn orange. I actually did that. But rather than the popularity contest, it would be nice to make sure that we have something saying this particular area is impacted and quantify it. Do you have a sense for how that discussion is going?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is make sure that the CARB framework is, specific enough on the types of criteria to look at and the process that they, satisfy their legal requirements under state law, but has enough flexibility for local districts to consider their own criteria. And one reason for that is different districts have different data sets. So you can't specify which data set to use because some have it and some don't. So these are all examples that they're providing, not necessarily, people have to do because they don't exist everywhere. We generally have more data than other districts do. They also are allowing us to weight different factors differently, which I think is important because different districts have different objectives and different types of things. At the end of the day, there is going to be a somewhat subjective component in terms of areas that we know have either have these impacts and may, for whatever reason, the metrics don't capture it, or they've been ignored for a long time, or even if they're not the highest ranked one is already being addressed through other things. So there's lots of different reasons why priorities might shift around for criteria that's other than 100% objective. One of the things that CARB mentions is the community capacity to participate. It's something we want to develop, but if there's a community ready to go and has partners there, that could come earlier. So there's a lot of other intangibles, I guess you might call them, that might go into it. And it's a full public process. I don't see it as a popularity contest, but even those kind of intangible, other non-data factors can be weighted, can be kind of put in the mix, right?
Okay. Thank you. Philip?
I'm sitting here listening to you and David, and I'm thinking about this morning in our earlier meeting and the robust exchange between Supervisor Nelson and Dr. Burke on this proposed tax increase and quarter-cent tax increase. And I guess I'm wondering, without mudding the document that much, the survey or the questionnaire that staff has been instructed to flesh out, you might be able to get some initial indication by zip code and by community about how people feel, not just about a tax increase, but what are their priorities, air quality versus jobs or things like that in a community, the economy and unemployment, whatever it is. You might be able to use that since there seems to be that's going to be going out fairly shortly. You could get some information back from all of these communities, all of them.
So, Bill, that question is actually in the draft survey.
Oh, is it already?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, we're looking at what we want to get the information from the survey people, the people who are answering our survey, our poll. We want to know what's important to them. What's their priority? Is their priority jobs? Is their priority health? Is their priority air quality? Whatever the case, that's one of the questions in there. So that is in there.
Yeah, it's not just about the issue that came up this morning. There's a much broader array of questions that
Yeah.
will be asked. Yeah.
Naturally, you guys are on the ball. So.
The issue this morning is probably the driving factor for the survey, but it's not the. It's a good opportunity to get a lot of good information, right? Any other questions? Okay, so I'll move through here. So monitoring, again, this falls in Matt's shop more than mine, but the CARB is going to develop the statewide monitoring plan. And again, the same idea that we're working with CARB on is it should have some specifics and some minimum requirements, but every community is going to be different. Every district's going to have different resources to bring to bear, so it needs to be flexible enough to be able to handle the situations you encounter as you go into these communities. So what the state's doing is essentially reviewing technology, including the low-cost sensors, and then provide some recommendations, talk about the low-cost sensor technology, and where we're headed in this is that, yeah, low-cost sensors where possible are great if it can address the issues in the community, but if they can't, you're going to have to look at other methods. We'd really like to have real-time continuous monitoring where you can. Not all toxics can do this, but it's much easier for resources, because if you don't have real-time continuous, you're taking samples back to the lab, and you don't have that, and even the community will have to wait 5, 10, 20 days until the lab is done and finish the data before they can see it. Well, if you have real-time feedback, that's much more useful for a million different reasons. So where feasible, we want to go, even if it's more upfront capital costs, we think it's better to get that real-time monitoring out there than the traditional methods. It anticipates that there will be community partnerships that conduct the monitoring, especially where the low-cost sensors are concerned. There needs to be some kind of statewide data display. There's still discussions on that. We're obviously going to want to have our own district display, and how do we tie those together or leverage both our resources to make that happen. The outreach is critical to any monitoring campaign. How do you communicate the data, interpret the data? You know, when you get real-time data flowing and people are looking at it in real time, like sometimes the machine malfunctions and you get a spike and you need to communicate that may not be a problem. It may be a problem with the instrument. A lot of quality assurance goes into that. So there's a lot of challenges here, but fortunately, you know, we've done a lot of this community ER monitoring in the past, in Paramount, in Compton, and I could list 20 other places over the past 10 years. So we have some experience with this.
Phil, question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the capital cost of the monitoring equipment. Is the district going to absorb that cost, or are the communities or the businesses in those communities going to be responsible for providing
question.
some of that cost?
So the 10.7 million that we received is partly going towards new staffing, but also partly getting us started on equipment purchases. As was mentioned earlier, our Rule 1180 now has requirements, and the state law required it, that the refinery facilities are going to actually pay for the community monitoring and conduct their own fence line monitoring. So there are some cost recovery things that are being looked at. I can tell you that people in the state legislature are, when we go and say we need money to fulfill the state mandates within this statute, and are asking for money, and again, they gave us $27 million in the first year, they're saying, well, why don't you just raise your fees? That's their response. And we keep telling them, we just raised our fees. It's not that easy to raise fees. There's Prop 26 issues. There's all kinds of things that have to go into that. So we're continually going to get that pressure, and we're going to continually fight back, but I can't say we're not going to have to make some progress in that area to get cost recovery at some point. Okay, so then the emission reduction plans, and this is you know, while the monitoring is going to fall in Matt's shop, this is likely going to fall in the planning division. Again, there's statewide guidelines to be developed on this, and this isn't as urgent as the community ID, because this is going to kind of come after you have the community ID and after maybe you start getting some monitoring data. But we want to make sure, the idea is to get real quantifiable emission reductions in the communities through a plan process. It needs to be transparent. We need input. These should be jointly developed plans. It's not just the district like telling the community what we're going to do. This guidance, again, at the state level needs to be clear and concise, provide accountability, but we need the flexibility at the local level. And again, it's going to could look like a little like a mini AQMP. Like, what are the current exposure levels and emissions? What are the future already adopted rules and regulations going to achieve? Is that enough? And if it's not enough, how do we get the additional reductions? And if that sounds very similar to an AQMP process, if you've followed that. But again, monitoring might uncover unidentified sources like we did in Paramount, and then we have to address that. And a lot of it's going to be mobile source, obviously, when it comes to diesel PM, and some of it could be these stationary sources if we find them. But what's kind of an open question is, are there going to be targets and timelines, and how do you do that? And you could probably come up with some rough outlines, but again, every community is going to be different, so we want to retain that flexibility. The BART, I won't go into too much details here, because if you'd like to participate in our reclaim working groups and all our other 15 rules that we're working on, then you're welcome to do so. But essentially, as I said earlier, we are sunsetting the reclaim program. Largely will satisfy this requirement of AB 617 to require BART on facilities. There is this statewide kind of database that for BART and BACT that BART is retrofit controls and BACT is for new facilities, to have those at a central level, at the state level. But again, our comments are, we can list them. It's a great clearinghouse, but other parts of state law says that there are differences in BART determinations at local levels, and we need to maintain that. So this is something that we're hard at work on right now. Emissions reporting, again, this isn't as much of a time and resource issue, but CARB is developing what's probably going to be a statewide regulation for emissions reporting. They already have that for GHG, and then they're essentially going to expand it to criteria pollutants and toxics. We just want to make sure that whatever they do is complementary to what we already do. We already have annual reporting while other districts don't. We're already ahead of the game here, but we don't want facilities to have to report to two different locations in two different ways with two different sets of protocols with different sets of data going in different directions across the state. That's our biggest concern. So we're trying to make sure it all fits together. There's also some questions. The state law says facilities with, quote, elevated toxic hotspots act priority scores must report, but it doesn't say what elevated is. So that's something that the state's going to have to work with us to try to define. So our current approach is, again, it's key that we closely coordinate with CARB. And I know that we've had a couple things come up that we don't necessarily on the same page, but that's probably the exception rather than the rule. I think we're working very closely and working well together. We are hoping that CARB utilizes the resources that the district has, the programs we have, the experience we have in developing the statewide programs, and that's happening. This workload and resource needs at the local level is just going to be an ongoing challenge for us. We're hiring new people, but is that enough? We're going to have to really see, because a lot of it's undefined. We did get the over $100 million for implementation on the incentive side, and then $10 million on the kind of the staffing resource side at the district level. We're already in the next budget cycle in Sacramento, and we need at least the same amount, if not more. So in order to make a case for that, we have to show successes with that first round, and the time's almost up already. So we need to show a lot of progress and success in spending the money in effective ways. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the board approved 36 FTEs and equipment purchases, and it's actually more than that. If the administrative cost for the $100 million will cover some more FTEs, and we're in the middle of a massive hiring campaign right now. We're bringing a lot of new people in. That's also a challenge and an opportunity. there's been there'll be some more posted, but probably the ones that have the lists we're developing for recruitment that are going to have the most people coming from those lists. A lot of those have closed, but I would keep an eye out for more. There will be more coming.
So if I could just add on to the outreach portion of that, we currently have 5 meetings scheduled. The first one is going to be on February 22nd in the City of Commerce. The next one is going to be March 13th in Wilmington. We're going to have one in Riverside on March 27th, one in San Bernardino, Loma Linda University on April 10th, and the last one is going to be in Anaheim on April 17th. We do plan on having more meetings, but these are the initial ones that we've scheduled. And I'll make sure that staff sends out the email the flyer to all of the members. It is on our website, so you can access it there, but I'll make sure staff emails out the flyer.
All right, so Bill, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess I had a comment more than anything else. Every time staff talks about raising fees, or it always bothers me. I know one of the guiding principles in CARB's concept paper is to provide assistance through incentive funding programs for small businesses that are part of the community to support their efforts to reduce emissions. And I think, I would certainly support this agency working with those of us in the regulated community to come up with some ideas or some ideas as to what we're talking about, what you're going to expect in terms of investments for compliance technologies versus our ability to afford that in the first place, and then come up with some sort of a number, a guesstimate, if you will, on what we're talking about, what we're talking about at the community level in incentive dollars. Since this is a state document, I'm assuming, maybe I shouldn't, assuming that it's implied that the state would provide this incentive funding.
So I have 2 pieces of good news, one of which you may know, I know Rita knows. So we recently released a request for proposals for quite a large sum of money, utilizing some of our collected penalty funds and settlement funds and mitigation funds to look. It's open to mobile sources, but we're really looking to get into the stationary source incentive arena, which we haven't done a lot of before.
I was at the bidders conference.
Yeah. So that's one piece of good news, and hopefully if we're successful and see a lot of good projects that we can make the case going forward that stationary sources deserve, as we did in the AQMP, that stationary sources should get a chunk of the funding that comes. It typically goes to mobile sources. The other piece of good news is that I mentioned the $250 million statewide that came through AB 134. And that is programmed specifically for Carl Moyer and Prop 1B programs, which is goods movement and trucks, essentially. And in the governor's proposed budget this year, not adopted yet, but his initial proposed budget, one piece of good news is the $250 million is still there. Second thing is that it's a little more, maybe it's more tied to AB 617 implementation. The first round this is more specifically tied to AB 617 implementation. But the other piece is that it specifically calls out stationary source incentives. So if that $250 million gets programmed again this year, if the governor has his way, then it's not going to all go to 1B and Moyer. There's probably going to be some that can be utilized in these communities for businesses to lower their emissions. So how that all works out in the legislature is anyone's guess, but the first steps are encouraging. Yeah, Rita.
Following up on that, excuse me. So would businesses have the ability to apply for that funding, or is that something that would go through the air district and not the business directly, and then the district would allocate it to the business? I'm not understanding.
Yeah, we don't know yet how that's going to get it's not even in the budget yet, but how these programs go. Some go to CARB as competitively bid. Some come to us, and then become competitively bid. So whether that stationary source funding is going to sit at CARB or at our level or some other state agency that we don't even know is we don't know that yet. Obviously, you probably can guess what the district position is that we'd like to see the money come locally and administer the program.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, seeing none. The next one is, it's a monthly written report on small business assistance activities, no motion required. It was in your packet that was sent to you. So we'll go to item number 8, other business. Any other business from any of the members? Okay, I do have one. We'll make sure we send this out to you in case you have anybody that might be interested. We're going to be having a community presentation on air pollution and AB 617. I'm sure Phil's going to be there on Wednesday, February 21st in Coachella Valley. We're co-hosting this with IVAN Coachella, which is an environmental justice group. And it's going to be at the Coachella Valley Mosquito and Vector Control District in Indio. I'm sure none of you are going to make it out there, but in case you know somebody out there that might be interested, we will be providing some light refreshments and snacks, and we will provide translation for those who need it. Okay, seeing none, is that it, or am I missing something? No? Public comment. Are there any public members that would like to make a comment? Seeing none, I just want to again thank Lori for outstanding work over these years. Thank you, Lori. Don't worry, I'm going to pay back legal. Have a good evening. Thank you.